Now, I want to turn from the general to the particular, and I want to look at the operation of witchcraft in the church. And I would like to read just a few verses from Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3 is the key verse in this context. Galatians 3, the first 3 verses. O foolish Galatians. None of us like to be called foolish, do we? I mean, there's a lot of other words we'd prefer to hear. But there are a lot of foolish Christians, you know that? Some of them are here tonight. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? The Greek word means literally to smite with the eye. It's the evil eye. I had a Greek Orthodox priest come to me some years back in the States who was baptized in the Spirit and flowing in the charismatic. He came to me for help because he said somebody had done this to him, put the evil eye on him. And he used the same word, vaskania, that is used in Galatians. It's interesting. He was very well aware that it was something real. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified? This only I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now being made perfect by the flesh? You see, whatever results were produced by witchcraft. What name would we give to the problem of the Galatians in modern theological language? One word. The word is legalism. How many of you realize that legalism is the expression of witchcraft in the church? When I realized that, it really shook me, because I saw the whole nature and operation of the church in a completely different light. Now, you don't have to answer this question, but how many of you would agree that legalism is perhaps the number one problem of Christians in Northern Ireland? And how many of you could believe that it's the product of witchcraft? You say, it couldn't be, Brother Prince. Well, are you so much better than the Galatians? They were a real, live New Testament church, filled with the Spirit, witnessing miracles. They'd had the Apostle Paul preaching to them in person. How many churches contemporarily could say, well, we're far beyond the Galatians? You don't have to believe me, but I ask you to consider it. I never jump off the platform, point my finger in somebody's face and say, that's your problem. The way I operate is this. I believe the Bible is a mirror. I hold it up and I say to people, just look in the mirror and act on what you see about yourself. I'm not going to charge you or accuse you or condemn you, but I am tonight holding the mirror up to you. Now, how should we define legalism? Usually it's a term of abuse used to describe people who disagree with us. You know, it's one of the favorite terms of abuse. But let's not indulge in that kind of cheap religious abuse. I'll offer you 2 definitions of legalism, and I'm not suggesting that they're final or exclusive. First of all, it's a seeking to achieve righteousness by keeping rules. I'll say that again. Seeking to achieve righteousness by keeping rules or a law. I want to point out to you something that will come up again. Most of the places in the New Testament where we have in our Bibles that righteousness does not come by observing the law, the word "thee" has been put in by the translators. What it actually says is righteousness does not come by observing law. Now, the pattern of law is the law of Moses, but that statement is not confined to the law of Moses. If you want to check on this and you're sufficiently interested, you can get a New American Standard Bible and read it, and you'll find that it puts "thee" in italics when it's not in the original text. And in most of the key texts, it's not there. In other words, the law of Moses is the pattern law, because it was a divine law. It was a perfect law. It was a God-given law. If righteousness could not be achieved by observing the law of Moses, then there's no other law that could possibly produce that result. The other possible definition of legalism is adding to God's requirements for righteousness, demanding of people that they do more than God demands of them to achieve righteousness, which is really putting yourself in the place of God. If God says, this is all you have to do, no church, no minister, no religious body has any authority to add one more requirement than God has stated. Now, you'll see from what Paul says in verse 1, he says, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified? What is the way that witchcraft operates? It's implied in that verse. It operates by obscuring the work of the cross. It blinds the people of God to what was achieved by the death of Jesus on the cross. Being blinded, they then have to turn to other sources of righteousness. Now, there are three aspects of what Jesus accomplished on the cross, all of which are relevant. First of all, he abolished law as a means of achieving righteousness with God, once and for all. Romans 10:4, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Catholic or Protestant, Jew or Gentile, it's the same for everybody. Christ is the end of law as a means of achieving righteousness with God for everyone who believes. Once you become a believer, that shuts you off from law as a means of achieving righteousness with God. Secondly, and this is not appreciated by most people at all, what Jesus experienced on the cross is the demonstration of God's judgment on our fallen, carnal nature. Romans 6:6 says, our old man, our carnal nature, was crucified with him. So the cross shows you what God thinks of man's fallen nature. It's his demonstration of his attitude. The mercy of God is that instead of doing it to us, he did it to Jesus. But if you want to know what God thinks about man's fallen nature, picture Jesus on the cross. Because that's his last word about our own unregenerate, carnal nature. The cross is where it belongs. The cross was made for our carnal nature. Thirdly, there's a message in the cross that applies to the way we live. The cross is not merely something external where our redemption was purchased, but it's an inner principle that has to apply in our lives. But once people are blinded to the cross, they're blinded to that inner principle. Paul says in Galatians 5:24, those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its affections and lusts. Note, that defines those who are Christ's. It doesn't use the word Catholic, doesn't use the word Protestant, doesn't use the word Baptist or Pentecostal or Methodist. It just says those who are Christ's. They're not defined by denomination. They're defined by what the cross has done in them. Those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its affections and lusts. See, Romans 6:6 says God did it in Jesus. Our old man was crucified with him. But there comes a point where that principle has to be applied by us in our lives. So Galatians 5:24 says we have crucified the flesh. We could not do it if God had not done it in Jesus, but it means that that principle of the crucified life, the denial of self, the denial of the will of the flesh, is part of the work of what Jesus did on the cross. But when people, by witchcraft, are blinded to the reality of the cross, they lose those three dimensions. They no longer understand that God has abolished law as a means of achieving righteousness. They no longer understand that the cross represents God's estimate of our carnal nature. And they no longer apply the principles of the cross in their own lives. They become carnal, self-indulgent, self-pleasing, self-satisfied. Now, legalism has one great hold on the human mind. It appeals to human pride. That's its grip. That's why people enjoy it. That's why people can be passionately dedicated to a legalistic religion. I hope I'll offend nobody, but I've lived in the Middle East for years. I've lived amongst Muslims. I'm familiar in some outline with the religion of Islam. And I've said many times, it has never made one person happy in more than 13 centuries. Not one person has ever been made happy by Islam. It's a religion of misery, of iron, of slavery. Why then are Muslims so passionately dedicated to it? Because it appeals to their pride. They can quote you all the things they've done to earn God's approval. But that is not limited to Muslims. It's really a feature of nearly all religious people. We become proud of our good works. And we become like Cain, who offered to God the fruit of a ground which God had cursed, you see. That's our old nature. Our old nature is under the curse of God. And whatever we give to God out of our fleshly nature is like the offering that Cain brought. It's an offering from something that God has declared cursed. And there is no way that it will ever be acceptable with God. Paul says many times, and I used to read that and think it's almost superfluous, but he said, we are saved by grace, not by works, lest anyone should boast. You find it's at least 3 or 4 times in the New Testament. I thought, why say lest anyone should boast? And then it suddenly dawned on me, because that's what people do boast about. And that's why people like legalism, because it gives them something to boast about. Like the Pharisee, I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all I possess. I don't commit adultery. But he was not justified. You see, if we think that we can offer to God something acceptable out of our old fallen nature, we are telling God, in effect, Jesus didn't need to die. Paul says, if righteousness can come through law, then Christ died to no effect. And when we say that to God, we incur his disfavor. Because anything we do to dishonor Jesus incurs the disfavor of God. It doesn't mean God will banish us from his presence, but it means that we cannot live in the favor of God while we are in any way undermining what Jesus accomplished on the cross. And that's what legalism does. It's very interesting. You find Paul wrote to a number of different churches, the Romans, the Corinthians, the Colossians, the Ephesians, and so on. If you study his letters, in almost every one of them, he began by thanking God for the people he was writing to. Even the Corinthians, when one man was living with his father's wife and there was drunkenness at the Lord's table, he still thanked God for the grace of God. But when he got to Galatians, he was so upset, he missed it out. His first sentence is, I marvel that you are so soon moved from the grace of God. They weren't committing adultery. They weren't getting drunk. What was their problem? Legalism. But you see, it was far more serious in Paul's eyes than those obvious sins of the flesh, which religious people are so quick to condemn, such as drunkenness or immorality, or things like that.